The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
China's rise to global prominence has been fast and remarkable. Reporter and author Joanna Chiu watched the last decade closely. She's with us tonight on her outstanding new book detailing that ascent. Then, Nam Kiwanuka finds out why the latest book from Giller Prize-winning novelist Ian Williams is reluctantly, but definitively, political. And as Remembrance Day approaches, we recall the contributions of First World War sharpshooter Francis Pegahmagabow, the most highly decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian military history. It's Tuesday, November 2nd, and that's all ahead on the agenda. A decade ago, all the talk about China was of strategic partnerships and a bright trading future. How times have changed. Over the past decade, covering China for the Toronto Star, the South China Morning Post, among others, Joanna Chiu has had a front row seat to the dramatic shift in relations with Canada and many others. She chronicles that in her new book. It's called China Unbound, A New World Disorder. And it brings Joanna Chiu to our virtual studio from Vancouver, British Columbia. It's great to have you back on TVO. Joanna, how are you doing?
Thanks so much, Steve, for having me on and highlighting the book.
Not at all. I'll tell you, I read it, obviously, and it is a very disquieting look at where things are at nowadays. So let's get into this. I want to start asking you a question that you pose in the book. Quote, with China on the rise, what kind of global leader would it make if it became the world's most powerful economy? Want to take a kick at that answer?
Yeah, so my family history is so bound up in what has happened with China and Hong Kong in the last decades. We actually went to Canada because of fear over the upcoming takeover of Hong Kong in 1997 after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. So growing up, I was always looking at China from Canada, from this very privileged position I had growing up in Vancouver, and interested in human rights and the development of civil society and economy in China. So I started reporting in Greater China in 2012, and I wasn't expecting that there would be increasing crackdowns in civil society. Back in 2012, when the current President Xi Jinping came to power, there was actually a lot of optimism about how he would steer China into perhaps a more liberal direction. But instead, the opposite happened. And unfortunately, I had a front row seat as the country sort of veered towards this direction where it was just instilling fear in so many of very moderate critics, including human rights lawyers. There were multiple cases where I was speaking with sources in China, lawyers or activists, and they would suddenly stop responding to me because they had been detained into the system of secret policing. So unfortunately, right now in Beijing, if you're anywhere in that sphere where you could be seen as a critic, where you are perhaps a threat to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy, you could face some pretty serious consequences. And increasingly, I think the world is paying attention because not only Chinese citizens, but foreign nationals, foreign citizens, are getting swept up in this reality of increasing crackdowns under President Xi.
Well, in fact, you say in the book, quote, China is thin-skinned. It threatens anyone who seems to have hurt its pride. And in many ways, you say China is very sensitive. Why would such a powerful force in the world be so thin-skinned in your view?
I try to provide a lot of nuance and historical context in the book because I think without looking at the wider picture, what we see happening can be kind of baffling. Why is China's foreign ministry lashing out at the mildest statements from the UN or countries like Canada or the US? So I go into as concisely and succinctly as possible the last 100 and more years, including a century of humiliation, which that time is known as in China. That encompasses the two opium wars where Britain and the Allied powers basically forced the opening of trade in China, basically forced the sale of opium drugs to Chinese people because the West wanted Chinese goods like silk and tea so badly and was frustrated that the Chinese didn't seem to want any Western goods in return. So basically manufacturing this countrywide addiction to opium. Things like this, they run really deep. It's deeply humiliating. And it's good to remember that China still continues to be a developing country where many people live in poverty. And Beijing is really committed to trying to increase the wealth of the country overall. So also coming from this place where there is anxiety internally about the economy and that people who might fail to climb up, the ladder and get richer might eventually stop being as loyal or supportive to the party. There's a lot of both historical anxiety and also current anxiety about the stability of the domestic economy and the support CCP gets from its own citizens.
Let me follow up on that because, we in the West tend to think when we put ourselves in the world, we tend to look back at least 5 or 10 minutes at our history before we consider our place in the world today. In other words, we don't look back much at all. How important is it for us to remember that for the Chinese government, to be sure, but also a significant chunk of the Chinese population, these century-old humiliations are important today, and we need to take that into account when we think about relations with this country. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I think it just provides context because a lot of people are worried right now about Beijing's rise and influence in the world. But I think people also overestimate the type of hostility that is involved. When you look at Beijing's actual actions, they are still showing up to international summits. They're still taking calls from world leaders. They're not seeming to be interested in isolating themselves. In fact, I don't think they have a choice because with globalization, China joined the World Trade Organization, its economy is so integrated and central to the world. So what I question is whether Western governments and societies are using these avenues of engagement well, whether it comes from a place where there is informed understanding of China's domestic situation and its foreign policy goals and what it's doing around the world in trying to cross over borders and surveil, monitor, and stifle criticism overseas. In the research for my book, where I focus on Western countries and I traveled around Europe, Australia, the US, Canada, the main theme and feedback I got from people is that they've been warning about some of Beijing's international influence efforts for decades. But it's only been recently where what happened in Canada with the two Michaels being taken brazenly as hostages, where it seemed more of the mainstream public and Western society started being concerned and didn't just look at China as a potential huge economic market, but that there are complex political realities as well, and definitely a chip on shoulders of Chinese leaders where they are seeming to overreact to criticism and to pressure from the West.
Obviously, we are going to talk about the two Michaels in a few moments' time, but while you have raised the issue of China basically trying to make friends all over the world as it relates to business with its New Silk Road Initiative, et cetera, there's a comment here. A prominent Greek businessman that you spoke to called China, quote, a modern-day colonizer. And he said the Chinese found out that by financing the infrastructure of the countries, you conquer them. Do you think that's a fair knock?
Well, I actually interrogate those assumptions. And what was interesting was that in Greece, this prominent businessman, he's actually head of the Chamber of Commerce there, is that he thought China was a colonizer, but he didn't think that was a bad thing. To him, money was power, and China having money meant that it was right to have more respect and control in the places, in the countries where it was providing loans, including, of course, Greece. So that kind of complicates things because he welcomed Chinese state investment in Athens port, taking over the port and the trade flows there. It was, on a large part, actually quite welcome on the ground among Greeks. And we don't see that kind of narrative, perhaps that's more prominent in the US and in Australia, where investments from China are, things to be suspicious of.
Well, here's the voice of China answering back. This is from I guess, a state-run organ called Global Times. And here's the comment. Canada, the UK, and Australia, 3 members of the Five Eyes Alliance, have recently taken action to put pressure on China. They have formed a US-centered, racist, and mafia-styled community, willfully and arrogantly provoking China and trying to consolidate their hegemony as all gangsters do. They are becoming a racist axis aimed at stifling the development rights of 1.4 billion Chinese. The formation of 4 states, except the UK, is the result of British colonization. Those countries share the Anglo-Saxon civilization. With a common language, a common historical background, and a coordinated attack target, such an axis is destined to erode international relations and allow hooliganism to rise to the diplomatic stage. Global diplomacy in the 21st century must not be hijacked by a fake international community with an axis of white supremacy. I hear you laughing, but that's axis of white supremacy. What do you make of that kind of language?
Well, just to provide a disclaimer, like the Global Times is perhaps the most hawkish and belligerent state-affiliated tabloid in China. Perhaps it's not entirely a direct mouthpiece from Beijing officials, but definitely it reflects perhaps a portion of the Chinese leadership, if not generally. I did, living in Beijing, speak with much more thoughtful people than what you would assume from the editorials that the Global Times regularly produces, or even the statements that the official foreign ministry regularly puts out. But what's interesting in that statement is it reflects some of the main talking points that the CCP uses to try to discredit international criticism. Canada, and along with other states, have been trying to work more on a multilateral level to put pressure on Beijing against what is happening, like the internment of around 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps in Xinjiang. Countries feel that speaking as a group, they have a stronger voice than alone, which I think makes a lot of sense. But Beijing is trying to shape this and make it seem like a racist attack, that any criticism of China is racist. And they're really, really deliberately trying to encourage conflation of the Chinese people, the 1.4 billion Chinese people, citizens, and the Chinese state. What is concerning to me is that while this seems ridiculous when you see it, flash across the screen, many people in the West do conflate Chinese people and the Chinese state. Former President Donald Trump, he has said repeatedly that he thinks all international students from China are spies, that they should be treated as spies. And scientists in the US have been persecuted and, found that there was no basis to these persecutions. And a lot of experts on China worry that this Red Scare, this conflation of the CCP and the Chinese people, is playing into what Beijing most wants to see. It wants to paralyze more productive and nuanced dialogue in the West by making it seem as if this is a racist attack that is just going to stoke xenophobia. Unfortunately, in the West, we haven't been very nuanced in showing that that's not what they're saying. We're not conflating the people of the states. And in my reporting, I draw on decades of warnings and testimonials from people of Chinese descent in countries like Canada, where they've been trying to warn that Beijing has been trying to do this, trying to support these narratives. But time and again, they have been ignored. They've been ignored. Now they continue to feel very just not supported. Myself, when I have reported on human rights in Xinjiang and received hundreds of threatening messages, going to the police, they tell me there's nothing they could do, talking to the Bill Blair's office and Ministry of Public Safety. Meanwhile, they say Canadians who feel concerned about threats from foreign sources should go to the police. But when people go to the police say there's nothing they can do. So it's kind of a circular response people get from from authorities that make them feel really unsupported, and that it's playing into this myth that people of Chinese descent are this homogenous group that all support what Beijing is doing, which isn't true.
You just used the word nuance there in that answer, and I think, if memory serves, about 3/4 of the way through the book, you talk about the fact that we're not living in times where we do nuance very well, and these are times in which maybe being able to act on a global stage with a little more nuance would be very helpful. What do we do about that?
So the cabinet in the U.S., Canada just had a reshuffling of the cabinet. But in general, people tell me that they worry there's not enough expertise on China advising governments. The Liberal Party in Canada, and definitely, many ruling parties in Canada, most of their advisors in China have been people in the business world, where, of course, they have really valuable lived experiences doing business in China, but they also have vested interests, and they also have interests in making sure that relations are as friendly as possible so it doesn't affect the business relationship. So people spoke to me of this assumption that Western countries like Canada could approach China with kind of dual track diplomacy. On the one hand, they could bring up human rights and bring up civil rights, and on the other hand, they can just aggressively expand economic and trade ties as much as possible, and those tracks will not cross. But that kind of assumption came crashing down in recent years when Beijing has done more acts of economic coercion or retaliation. So after Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou at the request of U.S. authorities, Beijing stopped importing Canadian canola and pork products for quite some time, as very clearly a way to put pressure on Canada to release Meng. And so that was done in conjunction with taking the two Michaels as hostages. And now, because they were released the same day that Meng was, it's very clear that they were, in fact, political pawns. So a lot of Western countries, the lesson they should take from that is it's not possible to have this kind of arrogant view where the West can only benefit from China's rise without thinking about political dimensions or that there could be repercussions on its people.
Well, since you've raised the two Michaels, let's follow up on it here. You're a friend of Michael Kovrig's, are you not?
Yes, I knew him personally in Beijing, and many journalists and diplomats and people who lived there at the time knew him. He was very social and friendly to everyone.
Have you been in touch with him since he's returned home?
I've been in touch with his family, but he is trying to take some time for himself and to obviously adjust back to what must be a very strange reality coming back to Canada as the global pandemic is continuing.
That sounds like a very sensible thing for him to do. Given how this situation transpired over the 3 years, more than 3 years that it did, what do you think is the single most important thing we learned about dealing with China as a result of the two Michaels situation?
What I get struck by in years of reporting on human rights is that individual lives and liberties isn't of great concern to China's top leaders. They've been incarcerating people for all sorts of reasons, including teenage bloggers who spread rumors about Chinese leaders that authorities did not like, including lawyers, like I mentioned, whose only crime was doing their jobs, basically taking cases of farmers who lost their land or Christian pastors who were stopped from preaching. So not only the two Michaels, but so many people have lost their freedom and basic human rights, I would say, from basically just whims of Chinese authorities who have been trying to basically crack down on all levels of civil society. Even the CCP says it supports women's rights, but a few years ago it arrested 5 feminists, and for the reason that they were attempting or planning to give out stickers on public transit to raise awareness about sexual harassment on buses and trains. So something like that is seen as a potential threat to Beijing. So let alone a major crisis, according to Chinese perspective, of its basically royalty, Meng Wanzhou, being taken, which was very humiliating. Of course, they didn't have qualms about trying to take some relatively high-profile Canadians. They're not high-profile in the sense that they were famous, but I think it seemed like there was a deliberate intention to arrest people that, frankly, white people around the world would relate to. And people have said as much to me that they knew that there were political prisoners for decades, including many in the past of Asian descent. But suddenly there were two men who basically looked like them, who looked like their friends, sitting in jail for almost 3 years as essentially political pawns. That really upset a lot of people around the world.
Mm-hmm. You know, I must confess that as I was reading the book, and as you were giving more and more and more examples of either Chinese nationals who are living here, who are being harassed for whatever reason, and numerous examples that you've given from around the world, I kept thinking, is she not worried about her own safety in writing this book? I mean, there's no question the Chinese government's not going to be in love with this book if they read it. Do you worry for yourself?
I think anyone who works on these issues worries for themselves and their families. And it's basically kind of a dark backdrop of all of us who work on China issues. And as a journalist, I really should be in a position where I shouldn't worry, because everything I write, I try to make it as factual as possible. And, you know, this whole interview in my book, it is as critical of the West for being ignorant or getting China wrong or, you know, acting out of self-interest as it is critical of Beijing.
Joanna, that's true, but I'm not sure the Chinese regime would necessarily note the nuance of that comment.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So a lot of China's actions have been really, to describe it, irrational. It doesn't make sense. Like, I try to provide the nuance and context to try to explain Beijing's actions, but overall, this great sensitivity, it means often China's diplomats and authorities are lashing out. They're not really seeming to make actions from a calm perspective. And that's very concerning, not just for people like me, individuals, but for, you know, global peace in general, when it's in a state of such instability. So it's tough because a lot of journalists have fled China. I worry about the foreign correspondents who are there on the ground still. Some, like a BBC correspondent, received death threats, and that's why he had to move his family out. 2 Australian correspondents got a tip that they were about to be detained in some sort of national security case, so they had to seek refuge at the Australian embassy in Shanghai and Beijing. So it's becoming really dramatic, and journalists and researchers who just want to report on the ground there, or even from overseas like I do, end up, you know, in these situations where they and their families are in danger. Journalists have been separated from their children, being questioned and interrogated. So it is a very tough situation. I'm not planning to go back to China or try to go back to China anytime soon. And definitely it's tough, because if you read the book, you can see how I clearly actually love my time in China and society and the people there. I really try to portray the nuanced perspectives of Chinese people, and including the interviews I was able to get from Chinese officials on background. They didn't want to give me their names, but they're also trying to raise alarm bells about how repressive things have become, where there's basically no room in the political system for there to be opposing voices, for there to be more of a dialogue. President Xi has really consolidated his power. And when I first arrived to my last time reporting on the political Congress in March 2018, people used to speak with me, but the last year, people pretended they all had the flu and lost their voice, literally, and weren't able to speak with journalists anymore.
Can you tell us, just finally, whether you think the West and China are inexorably onto a Cold War course now?
I think if it's up to certain forces in the US. I spoke with people in the military in the US who worry that there is this direction. There's a lot of kind of war drum beating where some influential people feel that there's some sort of ideological existential crisis that America is facing, where China is really trying to take over and diminish American power in the world as leading superpower. I hope that the more moderate voices in the U.S. will ultimately prevail and like put some checks and balances. And there's also responsibility for middle powers like Canada to also be like a sober, reasoned, nuanced voice in these conversations. I think a lot of people in Canada have kind of had the assumption that they're not powerful enough to make a change, so better sit back and let Washington steer the show. But that is not the case because Beijing basically dismisses anything that American officials say now. There's limited negotiation and dialogue opportunities between the US and China, whereas other countries might have the ear of influential Chinese officials more so. And if they are getting good information and advice from China experts, they might be able to use those opportunities better to kind of reduce real possibility of some sort of conflict in the future, not just this war of words that we're seeing and trade war, but an actual military conflict. I think we all have a role to play in trying to keep these avenues of discussion and dialogue open and to express that and to push the view that promoting universal human rights isn't something that the Chinese people don't want.
Well, that word keeps coming up, nuanced. And I can say that this has been an absolutely fascinating, nuanced look at China Unbound, a new world disorder. Joanna Chiu, it's been great having you on the program. And you can tell your cat that he or she obviously wants a cameo. Thank your cat for being as polite as, as it was over the past half an hour. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, Mimi is excited about her, her star showing here. Thank you for having us.
Not at all. Thank you.
A poet and Giller Prize-winning novelist, Ian Williams' words explore the inner workings of life, family, love. But though his life's work is literature, again and again he finds himself drawn into the political. His new book explains. It's called Disorientation: Being Black in the World, and it's already been shortlisted for the 2021 Hillary Weston Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction. Ian Williams is an associate professor of English at the University of Toronto and joins us now from the provincial capital. Hi, Ian. It's so nice to meet you.
Hi, you too, Nam. Thanks for having me.
I really enjoyed this book, and I don't know, if you were here, you could see how marked up it is. Yeah, congratulations on a great book. The title of the book is Disorientation. What did you mean by that?
So disorientation for me is the response that racialized people have to random or unprovoked reminders of our race. So we're going about our business, just doing our thing, and then someone interrupts our life to tell us about someone they know who likes reggae, or to ask where you're from, or some other kind of indication that says you are other, right? In this moment, you are a Black subject. And you are no longer the guy just trying to buy a shirt at H&M. Yeah, so that's disorientation. And I guess the second part to that, Nam, is that the recovery of that, from that disorientation, also burns up so much mental energy for people of color.
I think some people might hear that and say, so what? It's just maybe you're being too sensitive. Maybe the person is complimenting you because you remind them of Michael Jordan, whatever it is. But what does it do to the person who's getting that message?
Right. Yeah, I don't know about people's intentions. I don't read hearts or anything like that for a living. But I know its effect on me. to snap me out of the task that I'm doing and then to refocus. People say this about the internet too, right? Like, you're doing one thing, you get sidetracked, and it takes, what, 15 minutes to get back on track? Now imagine that in like human terms. You're trying to focus on something or trying to do your job, you get snapped out of it, and how much mental energy do you burn up on your commute back, or when you could be having really sort of engaged moments with your family, processing the day's events through a racial lens.
Why write a book of essays in this particular time on this subject?
Yeah, last year when I began, I was living in Vancouver at the time. There were wildfires. There was a pandemic really starting to like take hold here in North America. And of course, the justice movements that started in the US and spread around the world. And I put aside the novel that I was working on in order to write this book. It had a kind of urgency to it. I turned 40 a few years ago. And to be honest with you, I was kind of confused internally. There was a lot of noise that was happening externally.
Confused about what?
Confused about how this world can still exist, although we all know better, right? I mean, the social system can still exist and the justice system can still propagate injustices, although we all know better. And all of the noise that I was hearing around me was kind of similar to the noise inside of me. So I decided, Ian, there's no safety on shore, right? There's no safety trying to avoid this kind of conversation. You need to figure out what you think, and you need to understand how this world is working, because it's affecting you and breaking you down on a daily basis. And so that's the urgency and the impetus behind this book, Nam.
You said that you were avoiding it, and you're right. I know a fair bit, but never enough to seize authority. My dissatisfaction with my knowledge, coupled with my tepid emotions, occasionally nauseates me. Would I not be a better human if I were informed and angry? Then I could be righteous. I should be vocal, more than vocal, loud. I have received the message that to be Black these days is to be perpetually outraged and distressed, fed up, tired. To be anything apart from that is treacherous and out of touch. Is that what you mean?
Wow. Yeah. So I admire activists. I admire people who are very vocal, and I admire those people who are on the front lines, doing work in our courts and our civil systems. But not all of us have the fortitude or temperament to do that kind of racial work. And so the fact that a Black person in a moment of injustice is quiet doesn't mean that that Black person does not care or is not necessarily engaged. There are features of personality too that determine how we respond to tragedy. Some of us get sad, some of us just drink ourselves into forgetfulness, right? And what I wanted to do in that quotation is recognize what's expected of us, and then give people of color options or ways to be themselves still, right? That we don't have to sacrifice ourselves to some kind of single universal idea of what Blackness is or does. We can care and we can further progress in our own ways.
You say in the book that you are apolitical, and it's something that I whenever anyone has said they're apolitical, I've kind of looked at them kind of sideways, like, what do you mean by that? Everything is political. So in a way, when reading that, to me, kind of challenged how I view things. Is it even possible to be apolitical at a time when just being who you are is a political act?
Right. So it's one of these words that unfortunately these days has become charged and loaded and abused, so much so that I think within a few years it's just going to empty out of meaning altogether, right? We saw this a little bit with what is feminism anymore, right? And I feel, what is empathy? Why people are throwing around these words, and to a more glib extent, what does it awesome mean anymore? I think political, I'm never quite sure what people mean by that, but the dominant way of sort of using it in society these days is, well, in two ways, right? There's sort of political movements and politics, right? But there's also the sense of it being a kind of cause that's aligned already with a position, right? So to be political is to have like left-leaning tendencies, which, you know, doesn't bother me or anything, but to have your position predetermined as the basis of the conversation, I have a little bit of a problem with. And some of us don't live our lives with that as the dominant lens. What if I went through and I said everything is art, right? Everything is a work or an attempt at artistic beauty. And so I think the people who say everything is political, important, because it sensitizes us to a kind of slice of life. But then there are writers and artists and other people who say everything is art, and how beautiful are you living your life, and what are you doing with it? So, yeah, not to dispute you, Nam, right? But I hope you understand what I mean.
No,
by
I
it.
totally understand it, and I think a lot of people, we're talking about politics. The election in Canada happened, and I think we saw this a lot in the American election. And they were doing the postmortem of who voted for President Trump, and it turns out Black people indeed voted for President Trump, and some people couldn't believe that. I kind of understood that because Black people are not a monolith, and maybe some people voted for him because they see themselves as American first.
Yeah, and you know, it's always hard in those moments. You say it, I'm like, how and why, and all of that, which betrays that I, in fact, do have like political commitments, right? I do, and you know, we hope that people share them with us, but also to give people the right to have their own. And so there are Black Trump supporters. I'd be curious to know, like, what are they thinking, like genuinely, right? Like without being pejorative or without being condescending or anything. Like, what are they seeing that I'm not quite getting?
It could be taxes, right? But that's another conversation for another day. But I want to go back into the book again, and you write, I can no more stop the disorienting effects of such events than I can opt out of weather or grammar. It's not that I find race in everything, but that race finds me. How does race find you?
Yeah, right. It seems to, it's inescapable, right? So I could be doing something pretty innocuous, like stepping into an elevator, and the body language of the woman in the elevator tightens. And someone would say, is that a racial act or whatever? And I would say, yes, because I've seen that before, and I can layer that on top of my past experiences. I open my Twitter feed, it's all there. You could argue and say, hey, that's self-selecting. You choose who you follow and all of that, right? So it's hard to explain to a doubtful audience that that like I'm not pursuing race. I really am not, right? But if I just want to live with a reasonable degree of openness, the messages that I receive from the world are in fact racially inflected, right? Persistently racially inflected.
What effect does that have when, because I guess when it comes to racism or bigotry, some of it is very, it's out there, like but even with George Floyd, when he was murdered, we saw the video, and you saw people commenting online, well, he didn't follow orders, or he was making all these, I guess, excusing the behavior of the police officer instead of seeing the humanity of Mr. Floyd. What effect does that have on a person when you always have to feel like you're defending yourself as if your word is not your bond?
Yeah, it's so exhausting to keep proving yourself, right? And we know this for, like, you step into a grad school class and you're like constantly asked to defend your point of view and defend your point of view. And at some point you just kind of want to live and be trusted. But I think when people constantly ask us for proof of racism, the underlying presumption there is that, or assumption there is that we cannot be trusted to process the world. Right? That what we think has to be corroborated, that we are not sophisticated enough to have the apparatus to know what's going on. And that kind of doubt can really sort of do damage on you long term, because it can mean that as I process the world myself, it's not just a healthy skepticism that I greet it with, but with all of these other messages of, Ian, your perceptive apparatus is flawed somehow, right? You are somehow damaged. You don't know what is going on here. This objectively is not a problem. You are overly sensitive. And all of those messages that sort of bombard people of color need to be like put in their proper place. And no, you know what you're seeing. You know what you're feeling as a person of color. It cannot be proven, I think I say in the book. Sometimes it is just known. And what's going on in those moments is that your interlocutor, the person that you're speaking with, does not have that lived experience to know what it feels like intuitively. We've experienced it so much that it's gone to the level of intuition or gut, to know what it feels like in your gut to be discriminated against.
You write this story about an experience your friend went through with a police officer, and this line just sticks out in my head. You write, "Humiliation, like shame, doesn't need an audience."
Right.
Which was so
Right.
incredibly powerful.
Right.
The dynamics of that, can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's this kind of external proving to people, right? To sort of piggyback on what you asked before just now, this need to prove to others, but also this kind of internalized audience that we have them in our heads. And so if something happens at work, I've worked in very good places the last few years. If something happens at work and I need to explain that, I run through all of those motions internally first. Like, how would a white person see this? What might a white person what's their frame of knowledge coming into this conversation? How can I expand their frame of knowledge so that they can see what I'm seeing? But my humiliation is private and my own, and the countless kinds of indignities I have working, sort of coming into contact with service people, or just in the daily circuit of my life, those indignities remain private and embarrassing to share, although I do share some of them in the book. And frankly, I don't think I should have to parade the evidence of my life forward for people to trust and believe me. I feel like as a human being, I should have a basic and default kind of level of trustworthiness.
When you say that the embarrassed part, I've experienced microaggressions, and I've found myself in situations where other people have caused me harm. I haven't, just me being me, and I've felt embarrassed by it, humiliated even. But why is the person who is, I don't like using the word victim, but why is it that you're feeling embarrassed and you're holding that shame in private?
Right. Isn't that one of the bizarre things of racism, right? That you could be abused and exploited, and many abused people feel this too, right? That the abuse is somehow something to do with you. And maybe if I had done something differently. So the fallout of disorientation, that kind of mental repair work to repair myself psychically afterwards, involves asking those questions. Should I have done something differently? Should I have smiled more? Should I have worn a different shirt? When I entered the elevator, should I have acknowledged the person there? All these things. Is my hair too long? Is my hair threatening? What's going on in those moments? And that kind of after processing, that post-processing, I don't think white people go through their lives constantly revisiting situations through those racial lenses. We revisit situations in all the other ways too, right? I said something stupid at work, or I'm feeling tired and maybe whatever, right? We have all these other things that we're processing, and then there's that filter of race. What happened racially in that dynamic?
You say that you don't think that white people go through that. You write this story about this horrible incident that your niece went through. She's multi-ethnic, and you write about the Black Epiphany. But white people might not go through that, I think you write about how there is an understanding of using certain words or doing certain things to, say, Black people, where they know that they're in power. Can you tell us about what happened to your niece?
Yeah, so I talked about the time my niece was called the N-word for the first time. She was still in elementary school, quite young. And like
She was
that
10.
moment of racial, yeah, she was 10, right? That's what, grade 5? And so that racial awareness of suddenly someone pulling a card out that you hadn't seen before and levying it on you, the white girl who did it clearly knew that this word had power, and she deployed it at the right time and knocked my niece off balance. Black people come into a kind of racial awareness, and I think a white person can go their entire lives without coming into a racial awareness. That's personal. I don't mean like an understanding of, Black exists and injustice exists and all of that, but of the ways that their whiteness grants privilege and affords them, ease to move through life. So that kind of awareness it would be great if white people had moments of discomfort and disorientation, if they had a real sort of one-on-one chance to process what it feels like, being knocked down by surprise, and then having to reconstitute your identity in racial terms. And you know what, Nam? Sometimes it does happen to white folks, infrequently, right? If you push a white person and ask, no, where are you really from? You, not me, you, where are you from? And they go back beyond Canada and they say, I'm from Bulgaria and my mom's from Ukraine. And then something in them is able to understand what an immigrant's experience is like. The difference, though, is that they can tuck that away permanently. They never have to deploy that. They never have to even mention that unless someone pushes, because whiteness embraces them in a way that, like, humanity still tries to hold Black people at arm's length.
Well, you write that race originates in the white imagination. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I think people generally think that race is this kind of Black issue, right? That Black people feel it, we are affected by it, and we're the ones who will find solutions to it and tell people what to do about it, right? Tell us we'll tell you what we need, and then you can do it or not do it. But this is not a problem we created, and so the burden of, like, solving this problem is, like, unfairly placed on us for that obvious reason, and unfairly placed on us too because we're in a racial dynamic. And there are white people who are complicitly participating in this and also have a responsibility. And so they too need to participate in the resolution of this. So if a white person has constructed my life thousands of years ago, constructed what I mean and how much I'm worth and what I can do and think and whether I will be trusted or not, I think it behooves a white person too to figure out how to undo some of that.
How do you go about undoing that? Because it seems as if we get heads are, you go through the day, you have microaggressions. I've come to the point where I just don't even acknowledge certain microaggressions.
Right.
And then you have, when you do talk about this stuff, there is this pushback. No, this doesn't exist. And someone might use a quote from Dr. King. And then you just end up being at a stalemate. So how do we get to the point of moving forward and actually acknowledging this large elephant in the room?
Right. Yeah. I'm not sure how constructive anger is and all of that. I believe it starts with those kinds of kitchen table conversations about, okay, what was it like from the Ukraine and Belarus or wherever? It begins on that kind of one-on-one personal level. And I'm speaking in my own skin, okay? I'm not speaking for the race or anything like that. I believe that where progress can be had is in, like, on an individual level. First of all, like, explore and identify those kinds of biases and thinking, and then to kind of deal with them. I don't know if we can imagine sort of a future time that is, like, raceless completely and completely just. I think like, civil and political structures are just too complex and too dependent on inequity for that to happen in our lifetimes. But I do think our relations can be more humane on this one-to-one level, that the microaggression rate, whoever's monitoring that, should decrease just through these kinds of conversations. And then eventually enough of that. I think about it as a kind of trickle-up movement rather than a trickle-down Republican thing. With enough kindness and compassion, we can trickle upward towards systemic change.
We're in 2021 and we're still having the first of, we see that happening in the States with Kamala Harris making history.
Right.
You write about being the first. How does that affect you when you are walking into these rooms on a yearly basis? Like, your partner at one point in one of the essays that you write makes fun of you and says, because you keep a diary of how many Black people I saw today. But how does that affect you on a daily basis?
Right. My diary, Ian's diary of comforts, right? Ian's book of comforts. Every time I saw a Black person. Yeah, so it's a day-to-day basis, but it's been happening since like high school and university, right? If you're in predominantly white spaces throughout your life, you get to be shaped according to certain preferences and impressions about like what you should be. But I'll liken it to this, Nam, here. I think we are used to it. Black people, we often occupy spaces that are predominantly white, right? And so we don't even bat an eye anymore at this. But if I were to ask a white person to do the same, I've said, I'm going to displace you here from your comfortable life. I'm going to drop you in Tokyo, or I'm going to drop you in Nigeria, and you're going to be the only white person in just moving through your life. You're going to buy groceries, you're going to go to your job, you're going to do all the things you normally do. And tell me how you feel. And suddenly they will be aware of their whiteness in a way they have never been aware of it before. That kind of hypervisibility will do its work in that situation. And you know what? I would go further and say that most white people in that situation would opt out, would find a way out of it. Unless they are being worshipped, right? Unless like their whiteness carries some kind of advantage, and then they'll stay and play God. But given the chance of being the only and the exceptional, constantly reminded of their whiteness day after day, I think they would avoid that situation and get out of it somehow. As Black folks, as people of color, we don't have that option.
Thank you so much for writing this book. I wish we had more time. I'll end on this note. Despite all of that, you write, your obligations to the world don't stop despite its hostility to you, and we keep moving forward, right?
Thanks for that, Nam.
And congratulations on being inducted into the Brampton Arts Walk of Fame as well. Thanks so much, Ian. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
When you are over there, break apart a branch, a dry, dead branch, and then chew on it a while. You are not to swallow this, but keep this in your mouth. You will then be able to pass through the lines.
This is one of the few war stories Francis Pegahmagabow, Canada's most decorated First Nation soldier, shared after World War I. He was a skilled marksman, credited with 378 kills as a sniper during his 4 years on the front lines.
In some ways, he was almost legendary in the war, and this was amongst the members of his own battalion, because he had such extraordinary successes, not just as a sniper, but also as a scout, helping lead men out of situations, harrowing situations that should have, by all likelihood, ended all of their lives. He also seemed to have this ability to come back with this kind of intel that often would allow his battalion and the greater Canadian forces to make these great advancements. So there became this almost semi-urban legend or battlefield legend about the soldier who could become invisible, or the ghost soldier as he might have been called by some.
Brian McGuinness never met his great-grandfather, but carries his possessions, and more importantly, his stories.
And his stories were so far-reaching, so extraordinary, and so impactful to all peoples that they wanted those shared in a forum that they felt they could perhaps never reach.
McGuinness is the author of Sounding Thunder, the stories of Francis Pegahmagabow. McGuinness was very close with his grandparents, who at the time were the last living children of Pegahmagabow.
He didn't want his children to know about the strife and the grief and the difficulty of war, and that's why he went to war, in part such that they would hopefully never have to experience such a thing.
Pegahmagabow was orphaned at a young age. His parents, members of the Wissahickons First Nation on Parry Island near Parry Sound, died when he was just a baby. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914, the young Ojibwe soldier was among the first recruits. He was among 4,000 First Nations people who served during World War I.
He didn't have to serve, but he volunteered, and he served from the start of the war. He was treated as an equal in the battalion. The accounts by other soldiers talk about Pegahmagabow being really one of the elite soldiers. He was feared throughout the German army. He often ran across the battlefield delivering messages, which was one of the most dangerous jobs during the war.
And he was recognized for his bravery. In 1916, he was one of the first Canadians to be awarded the Military Medal. He would go on to earn 2 more. Many of his possessions, including his medals, were given to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa.
Many of these Indigenous soldiers who survived the war, and of course they suffered very high casualties as well, like all Canadians, came back to Canada after the war with a really new sense of purpose. They had served their country, they had served the king, they had stood shoulder to shoulder with their comrades, and they came back to a country that treated them again as wards of the state. And so many of them, like Francis Pegahmagabow, became politicized.
I think as a result of not only having experienced that sense of equality for a brief time, but having made such profound sacrifices in the name of Canada, to come back and then just simply once again find yourselves so controlled, so regulated, so governed.
He served in the Wissahickons' Perry Island community as a counselor and then a chief.
A lot of those men suddenly began to use those voices that they had discovered to speak out against what they felt was very, very wrong.
He fought against taxation for Indigenous people and for land rights.
Francis's life from the get-go was dedicated to helping life and preserving life, because it was the acts of saving life that he wanted to be remembered for. Because life is sacred, and that life had to be protected.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. Tomorrow, author and now ordained Anglican minister Michael Coren explains why he thinks the portrayal of Christ by many Christians simply doesn't reflect the much more rebellious Christ that emerges from Scripture. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.
The Agenda is always on. To catch up on conversations from this week or any week, visit our website, tvo.org/theagenda, or our YouTube page at youtube.com/theagenda. It's all there for whenever you want to watch.